The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank.
The state of the world is in a flux. To say that is an understatement. And to explain it to us on Off the Cuff today, I have Ian Bremmer. It's tough to describe him. I'll let him do it himself. He is, besides other things, a global thought leader. You should check out his speeches, his writings. He's the author of a book, The Power of Crisis. It tells you how we respond to the three big crises of our times would determine our future. And these three big crises are the artificial intelligence revolution. In fact, I would have guessed the other two easily. That is climate change and global health emergencies. But I would not have immediately thought of artificial intelligence. And he's the president of Eurasia Group and also an organization which I have just learned from him to pronounce correctly, G0 Media. That means if there is zero global leadership, what happens? Ian, first of all, describe yourself and then tell us, are we in a situation where the world has so many crises and there is zero leadership?
Well, I'm a political scientist. I'm left-handed. I'm a Scorpio. I'm the son of my mother. I travel all around the world. I'm pretty friendly. And I'm looking forward to talking about all sorts of global stuff with you, my friend. So that's more than enough self-description. Are we really in a world without leadership?
All right.
What?
I said you sound friendly. All right.
I'm friendly. I'm absolutely friendly. We are clearly in a world with fragmented leadership. I mean, you wouldn't know from the institutions, from the response to crises, from the lack of sense of direction and values and what the world, what humanity stands for, you wouldn't know that this is a world with a superpower or two in it. And so, yes, I do believe that that G0 describes our world much more appropriately than G7 or G20 or G2. I think that if aliens were to come down and look at the world in toto, they would not believe that it was being governed or led by one or two or a group of central governments. No one would think that.
Yeah. And when was the world less worse than this?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you look at the Human Development Report that just came out at the General Assembly, we see that the last 2 years have had 5 years of regression in terms of human development, where migration, forced migration, education, healthcare, life expectancy, food availability, you name it. For your and my lifetimes, that's never happened before. In a period of globalization, every year, human development was improving, not as fast as we'd like, and with some unintended consequences like more pandemics and more carbon in the atmosphere and more proliferation of dangerous technologies. Yes, but still human development was improving every year. And now for the last 2 years, human development has been turning backwards. And indeed, the vast majority of that pain is on the back of the poorest. It's on the back of the global south, the developing world, the majority of the world's 8 billion population. So I would say that for all of my lifetime, the world has been in a less problematic position than it's in right now. And that's before we talk about whether or not we're facing another Cuban Missile Crisis. I wasn't around in 1962. Maybe you were just barely, maybe. But it does feel like another Cuban Missile Crisis is wholly plausible.
I was a 5-year-old adult.
Yeah. So yes. Well, you were clearly reincarnated. Who knows what you came from, what your previous lives were. But this is my first time on the planet. So 1962, I don't have an experience.
That I shall tell you offline. We'll discuss this. Yeah. So who is to fix this world now?
Well, we all are, of course. And what's interesting is despite the fact that the United States and China don't trust each other at all, and despite the fact that the US, the most powerful country, is quite politically dysfunctional and divided, more so than any of the other G7 economies, there still is progress being made. And that progress is coming in part because of these crises. So, for example, 10 years ago, you had a lot of people that thought that maybe we were heading towards 4, 5, even 6 degrees centigrade of warming before we would turn it around. Now, most people that are even skeptical about commitments that are being made by, the world's biggest companies and banks and countries are saying it's more like 2.5 to 3 degrees. Now, that's a very big shift. And that's a shift that doesn't come because Washington and Beijing decided to sit down and have a let's come together moment. That hasn't happened. But rather, it's because the world has come together. The EU, the European Union, has played a really big role. Individual American states, governors and mayors, like in California and in Texas, have played a very big role. Some conservative, some liberal. A lot of companies and non-governmental organizations, and even a few individuals have played a big role, like Mike Bloomberg or like Greta Thunberg. And I mean, or like Antonio Guterres, perhaps most importantly at the United Nations. And when you add all of that up and you look at the extraordinary amount of investment into new post-carbon technologies, you realize that within a generation, the world's energy is going to look completely different. And again, what makes me hopeful about that is the fact that it happened despite the dysfunction among the world's top global leaders, despite the fact that when you look at the biggest countries in the world and you ask, who are the presidents and prime ministers of those countries, it doesn't inspire, right? You don't say that's not where you think the world, if the world's not going to get better on the back of Trump and Biden and Xi and Putin and Macron and Truss or Johnson, that's not, if those are the only people that we can count on for the 21st century, we're in very serious trouble. But that it turns out that those aren't the only people that we can count on, and that's a really big deal.
So, 3 biggest crises right now in order of importance, in order of significance. And then list for me the 3 biggest opportunities that we have right now.
3 biggest crises in order, descending priority of importance. I would say number 1 is the importance of disruptive technologies and whether or not we are capable to prevent their proliferation. Number 2, because it's a hockey stick. It comes so much faster than anything else. And the ability to wipe out the planet, if unaddressed, is, or at least humanity on the planet, is staggering. Number 2 is climate change, without any question. It is impacting everyone around the world. When you have 1 billion Indians that aren't allowed to work outside after 10 a.m. Because it's just the conditions, the weather conditions make it dangerous to do so. When you have 1/3 of Pakistan underwater, or you have California under unprecedented drought conditions, or Florida being hit by unprecedented storms, doesn't matter where you live, and it's only getting worse every year. And then 3rd would be the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the implications of that for Europe, and the implications of that, frankly, for the transatlantic alliance, for the G7, and possibly, if this becomes a nuclear confrontation, even for the world. I'm less concerned about that latter. I think the likelihood of that is very low, but even if it's only 1 or 2 or 5%, that's a lot higher than it's been at any time in my lifetime. And so I would be remiss not to bring it up.
And yet you list that as number 3.
Yes.
Why? Not 1. Why not?
Well, if I really believed that nuclear confrontation was 30 or 40% likely in the way that perhaps Elon Musk says he does, then it would be probably my number 1 risk. But I don't. I think the likelihood that Putin would use nuclear weapons because he understands just how much of a no-win that would be for him and his regime is actually very low. The likelihood, if he gave the order, that order would be followed even is questionable, because such an attack would go against existing Russian nuclear strategy and doctrine, which, of course, the chain of command is well aware of in Russia. So I think that's been overstated by the media. For me, the threats have more to do with whether the Russians decide to engage in asymmetric attacks against a NATO that has been really supporting Ukraine very heavily in the fight. Cyber attacks, fiber attacks, pipeline attacks, critical infrastructure attacks. Might we see the Russians do that? And could that lead to a broader confrontation between Russia and NATO in Europe in a way that so far it's really been a confrontation just in Ukraine?
Yeah. At the same time, this invasion has caused different kinds of crises all over the world. Energy, for example.
Food.
Inflation, prices, food. And we don't know how long this will go on for. So that's an important point. But before that, how seriously do you take Elon Musk?
I talked with him a couple weeks ago before he put all of this stuff out on Twitter. And he told me at the time that he had been speaking with Putin and that he believed that this war was going to get much worse unless we found a way to negotiate. And he told me what Putin's negotiation principles were, which from my perspective were non-starters in at least some of the cases. And I told him why. And I said, you shouldn't take Putin's word at face value. I can't tell how much of that is Elon really believing that Putin should be satisfied in some way, and how much of that is Elon worried about the potential threat of Putin's cyber attacks or disruption attacks against his company, against his satellites. I can't tell. But I was surprised and dismayed that Elon decided to weigh in publicly in the way he has in favor of Putin's proposals, especially because it's being used by Russian state media to promote that propaganda. And because if Musk ends up buying Twitter, we already see former President Donald Trump publicly starting to articulate many of the same themes. So I do worry that, the strength of the response to Russia in defense of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, something which most countries in the world proactively support. The Europeans have stayed very strong. The Americans have stayed very strong. I am worried that the US might actually be more vulnerable to an internal political split than the Europeans will be. The Europeans are under much more economic pressure, but it is their war. It's on their continent. They have directly invited, 27 countries invited Ukraine to join the EU. For the Americans, it's far away. You've got much stronger political division, much more willingness to go after Biden on the part of the MAGA Republicans. And now you've got Elon Musk weighing his thumb on the scale. So I do think it's something to watch carefully.
You think Putin planted this on Musk, knowing Musk's personality? And
No, I don't. I think that Putin sees opportunities and tries to use leverage wherever he can. And certainly, I think that what he told Musk was no different than what he told the Indians, the Chinese, and the Kazakhs at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Uzbekistan, a couple of weeks before. So I don't think this is a particularly new line. I just think that Musk is susceptible to it. Remember, Musk is someone that was kind of a hero for the Ukrainians in the early months of the war because he made available Starlink and he activated it on the ground in Ukraine. And that made him a belligerent in the war from Russia's perspective. And when the Ukrainians asked Elon to activate Starlink in Crimea, he said no. And it's interesting because on the one hand, why would the Ukrainians ask for that if they're saying they're not going to invade Crimea? That's an interesting question. And Crimea has been a redder line, of course, for the Russians for reasons we can talk about than the annexed territories that they've annexed illegally over the course of the past couple of weeks. On the other hand, I understand, with suddenly with Elon recognizing that if he continues to provide support for Ukraine, that he's making himself vulnerable vis-a-vis the Russians is, of course, a consideration that is going to go into anything he would say. I mean, if you saw what Elon said about Taiwan, where he actually came out just a few days ago and said that Taiwan should become an administrative entity of China, like Hong Kong. And you say, well, why would he say that? Well, Tesla's biggest market, soon to be biggest market, is going to be China. It's also where they source a lot of critical minerals. And it's where they develop a lot of their artificial intelligence. And, I do believe that you can't possibly make an assessment of what Elon is saying publicly without being aware of that economic reality. So I am concerned, of course, that the richest man on the planet and someone with an incredible amount of power to individually determine the outcome of some geopolitics, not many, but some, nonetheless is making some shareholder decisions at the same time. That's an unusual situation to be in.
What's the best case scenario for Putin in how this war might end? Practically,
Well,
best case scenario.
So one of the reasons I've been pessimistic about the crisis is because the best case scenario is much worse for Putin than if he had never invaded, right? I mean, you can't make him whole. You don't want to, and you can't. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't. Economically, he's being decoupled from the G7, from Europe particularly, and that will never come back. I mean, even if Putin were to step down and some new leader came in who wanted to work with the Europeans and pulled everything out of Ukraine and paid reparations, and none of that is plausible, right? But even if that happened, the Europeans have already made other plans. They're pushing efficiency. They're expanding nuclear. They're getting LNG from the United States. They're getting gas from Qatar. Russia's never coming back. So, I mean, the reality that we have taken a G20 economy out of the G7 completely, that's never happened before. Then you look at NATO's expansion. Well, Finland and Sweden aren't going to suddenly say, okay, we're done with NATO. So, I mean, the best case scenario is that Putin is forced out and you get a constellation of Russian leaders and the transition is smooth. And you get a constellation of Russian leaders that actually don't see NATO as a threat and want to find a way to live peacefully on their borders. And it will be a much poorer Russia. It'll be a Russia that goes through immense domestic instability and hardship, but it will be a more stable Russia ultimately and a more peaceful world. Now, I think the likelihood of that is very low, 5%, 10%, something like that. If you want a more likely, less negative scenario is that the Ukrainians take as much territory as possible in the next weeks to months before the Russians get all of their troops from the mobilization on the ground in Ukraine. And that means that they have taken much of Kherson, a good part of Luhansk, a good part of Zaporizhia, probably not much of Donetsk. And they're not quite to their February 24th borders, but they've taken a lot of territory. The Russians can't claim credibly to have annexed any of this territory. The Russians get their troops in. It's now winter. It's harder to fight. And the Ukrainians are kind of exhausted. And so there's still some shelling. There's still some fighting sporadically. And Zelensky decides that he needs an operational pause. There's no negotiations. There's no ceasefire. But there are some people that are going back and forth that are doing shuttle diplomacy informally between Kiev and Moscow. And that over time, that could help to freeze the conflict and facilitate negotiations that maybe over time could get the Ukrainians back all of their territory, with the exception of Crimea. That, I think, is the best, that is the least bad possible scenario. And in that scenario, Putin is still considered a war criminal, but it's not resolved. In that scenario, Russian assets are still frozen for years. They're still cut off from the West. Their economy goes down not 5% this year, but 20, 30, maybe 40%. So there's a lot of danger in that scenario. But if the world stays together, and especially if we see the Indians, the Chinese, and others who increasingly are publicly very unhappy, uncomfortable with the way Putin has proselytized this war, if they are prepared to work more closely with the West and the West with them, that gives Putin very little room for maneuver. I mean, even Iran and Belarus did not recognize the annexation of these Ukrainian territories. Only North Korea, and that's really quite something for a country that Xi Jinping called their friend with no global limits back on February 4th. So I do think that the reality of the scale of Putin's misjudgment is being made clear to him. Whether he's prepared to accept that reality and when is an open question.
Would America be would the world be in a better place if Trump was leading America right now, or worse?
No, it would be in a worse position. I do think that Putin would have been less likely to invade Ukraine if Trump were president, because he would have no idea how Trump would react. And, there'd be a fat tail possibility that the Americans would be directly involved in a hot war with Russia from day one. And I think it's harder for Putin to play that. I think Putin was much more able to misjudge Biden as weak, especially after the Afghanistan withdrawal, and especially given Merkel's departure, Macron's strategic autonomy, all the rest. But on almost every other issue, remember that Trump was actively questioning the value of NATO. He was actively questioning the value of American allies. He was making them deeply uncomfortable. He was doing a lot, not just to further divide the United States domestically, but also to further divide America's alliances all over the world. That's what America First is very attractive to nativists inside the United States. America First is not meant to appeal to anyone outside the United States. Now, Prime Minister Modi had a good relationship with Trump, in many ways better than with Obama, but that is the exception internationally. The vast majority of American allies, not Israel, not the Saudis, not the Emiratis, not India, but everyone else had a worse relationship with Trump, and most of them had a dramatically worse relationship with Trump. And in an environment of a Russian invasion, of course, that makes the world a much more dangerous place. It means that rogue states and rogue organizations have much more room to threaten, to act with impunity, to throw away ideas of common values, of basic humanity, of the United Nations Charter. Nobody wants a world like that except for the rogues and the criminals themselves.
So you see, how do you see the chances of Trump making a comeback?
So I would say 6 months ago, Trump was 80% likely to get the nomination, the Republican nomination. I think today it's 60% likely. So let's say it was 40% likely he'd be the next president. Now it's 30% likely, maybe a little less. Maybe it's slightly less than 50-50. He wins if he gets the nomination. Can't tell. So I think that it's become the base case scenario for the United States is less problematic, whether it's a Democrat or a non-Trump Republican that comes in. And by the way, if it were a Governor DeSantis or someone else, I think that is vastly still more stabilizing than a second Trump term. Trump individually is the problem because of his willingness to subvert rules of democracy, norms, act in criminal ways, appeal to authoritarian impulses, all of these things. But the likelihood that Trump will break the election if he gets the nomination is going up. That's a tail risk, but it's getting higher. And that's because in 2020, when Trump tried to break the election, and of course, culminating in the events of January 6th, he really didn't have anyone in power that agreed with him. He had advisors, but he didn't have anyone in power. In 2024, there will be a number of state officials, of governors, of state secretaries that have actual authority over the elections who are election deniers themselves. And therefore, if Trump is the nominee and he runs and he loses, but it's a close election, Trump's ability to break the outcome leading to a constitutional crisis goes up. Maybe that was 2% before, maybe now it's 5%, maybe now it's 10%. So you have to keep both of these ideas in your head at the same time, that the likelihood of Trump becoming president is going down, but the likelihood of a constitutional crisis, which is a low likelihood, is going up.
So a very India-centric question. And I know it's tough for Americans to understand Indian politics. It's also tough enough for us Indians to understand American politics. India is a Quad ally. All kinds of nice things are said about India. India is important for Biden administration. And I know the problems in the American confirmation process for ambassadors. But this is almost halfway into Biden's term, and India still does not have an American ambassador. This is now beginning to look ugly. There's a 2-year waiting list for visas for Indians. It's 2 days for the Chinese. It's playing very badly in public opinion in India. If anything, the sense is that Biden administration is shambolic.
Well, maybe we need another Howdy Modi trip to the United States, where the Indians show how important their voting bloc and their giving bloc is inside the United States to Democrats or Republicans. Of course, that mattered to Trump a lot. And he was very happy to turn out in a stadium with 100,000 people that were screaming and yelling for him and for Modi together. That made him very happy. Now, of course, the United States is unhappy with the fact that India has radically stepped up its energy purchases from the Russians, much more than the Chinese have. The United States is unhappy with the fact that the Indians haven't been with the Americans in key votes in condemning the Russians, and this will happen again at the General Assembly this week on the annexations. Instead, the Indians will be voting with the Chinese. And so for a Quad partner, of course, that's something the Americans aren't happy about. And there's been some willingness of the United States to work a little bit more with Pakistan as a consequence of that. I'm not suggesting I like that policy or I don't like it. But I will say that the Quad, of course, has strategic importance for the U.S. and it has strategic importance for India. It would be better for the United States if the U.S. were to expand the Quad to include countries like South Korea and Canada. The Indians want no part of that. They like it being small because it makes the Indians more important. I understand that. And the fact that you've created this organization that the Americans show up to and the Indians can tell everyone else in the region, we're inside, we've got influence, we've got access, we can tell you what the Americans are really thinking, has actually helped the U.S.-India strategic relationship in ways that nothing else would have. So I think that we have helped to create more of a baseline that ensures greater strategic alignment between the two countries. But I also understand that there's not a lot of trust. I also understand that in a world where life is getting harder for poor countries with inflation, with food inflation, with energy challenges, with lack of vaccines, with hangover effect, interest rates going up, indebtedness going up. There are, climate change being more problematic for poor countries, but very little money coming from wealthy countries. If I'm a member of the global South, and in many ways, India is the leader of the global South, not China. China is the largest creditor for the emerging markets. China actually has a higher per capita carbon footprint per capita than the European Union does today. China's not a part of the global South. There's something else. The global South is increasingly led by India. And I think that there are lots of reasons why the global South is going to be increasingly unhappy with the West. And the West needs to address that. The advanced industrial economies needs to do a lot more and not just listen, but take steps to act. And this is something that Schultz in the G7 chairmanship this year understands. Kishida taking over the G7 chairmanship next year understands, but understanding is only the first step. You need to take action. I think that this is going to drive a tougher reality between India and the United States, between India and the G7. And India's own chairmanship of the G20 is going to be very interesting as a consequence this year.
How does it stop the US from appointing an ambassador? Maybe somebody else, if this one is not getting cleared?
Yeah, Biden has gone. This is not just an India problem. This is a problem with a number of domestic appointees for core politicians, political figures in the U.S., problem with a number of ambassadors around the world. Keep in mind that ambassadors don't actually matter very much to move policy. historically, the way you get most ambassadorships in the United States is you raise a lot of money, you give a lot of money to a president, to a candidate, usually like $2 million is minimum table stakes to get a tiny little country. You raise or give a lot more and you can get a bigger country. That's very embarrassing. It leads to really poor quality appointments for the United States. The UK does a better job.
Can I interrupt? So what happens is that in any capital, particularly a country like India, capital like New Delhi, nobody wants to relate to a DCM when it comes. No minister, not Indian foreign minister. I'm afraid not even the Indian foreign secretary, for that matter.
No, I understand that. All I'm telling you is that the reality is that there is a serious problem with not having an ambassador. It's embarrassing. It's symbolic. It makes it seem like the country doesn't matter. What I can tell you is at the administrative execution level, the policies don't change. The ambassador actually knows usually very little, might have some access, might not, but doesn't usually work that hard, doesn't usually do that much. It's kind of a party position. It's stupid, but that's kind of the way it works. And I'm not suggesting that makes it feel any better if you're a member of the Indian public saying, why doesn't the United States care about us? Now, I will tell you, if you're India and you had a choice of we get to be in the Quad or we get to have a US ambassador, I think you choose the Quad by a factor of about 50. So that's also relevant to think about.
Okay, now I'll take some questions from our subscribers and friends and my colleagues. So Jaideep Gadhavi, who's read your book, he says, you start your book with a quote, to a glass half full, that first half was tasty. Can you please elaborate which half are you referring to? Or how is it tastier than the current half? Or is it just the geopolitical rhetoric or something that has really gone wrong on the ground?
Oh, no. It's not rhetoric at all. It is the most honest and authentic statement I could possibly give anyone reading my book, coming right from my heart.
Hang on. He has put a condition. He says, please leave Europe aside for a moment.
Sure, that's fine. Doesn't matter. Doesn't change my view in the slightest. It came from me. It's me, Ian Bremmer, a friendly political scientist. I am fundamentally an optimist. I'm fundamentally hopeful. I came from very modest beginnings, though I was very lucky to be born in the United States with my mother and as a white guy. And yet, if I look at the opportunities I've had, I don't get to complain about anything. And it makes me very hopeful about the future. It makes me feel like human beings have agency, can make a difference. But I also think that we are responsible individually and collectively for the decisions that we've taken for where the planet presently is. And when I say that first half was tasty, I'm talking about the half that we drank. The reason why globalization has been so successful economically, the reason why our education levels, our life expectancies are so much higher is because we've taken so much from the planet that we haven't replenished. So we benefited from that first half of the glass. We get to live to 80, 85, 90, sometimes longer. And as a consequence, we've got a path towards 2.5 degrees centigrade of warming on the planet. We drank the first glass. I did. You did. I drank more than you did. And the people in power that are making the big decisions drank more than both of us, but we're responsible. But we're also the ones that need to recognize the glass is still half full. And there's a lot of things to do to make sure that we stop drinking the rest of it. That's what that quote is all about.
So now there's a dollar question. I don't know if you saw Ruchir Sharma's article in Financial Times today. He said dollars become too expensive and it suits America now to sell the dollar, even as they try and control inflation, because he says that American inflation is not driven by imports. Nevertheless, dollar is an issue in India as well. So Ari Daman wants to know, given that the US, Ari Daman's words, given that the US has used dollar dominance to punish, damage, or destroy and reward nations that US disagrees or agrees with, is the dollar a currency or a weapon? And what is the future of the dollar?
Well, the dollar, of course, is a currency, first and foremost. This is how we define a currency. But the dollar has been on occasion weaponized. And the fact that it is the dominant reserve currency in the world, and that there are no feasible alternatives to it at scale. None, not Bitcoin, not gold, not the euro, certainly not the RMB, means that when the United States decides to impose sanctions or other coercive economic elements of diplomacy, that other countries usually have to go along. I mean, the Chinese are not going to break American sanctions because they're worried about the impact of falling afoul of American financial institutions, of SWIFT, right, of the banking system and the rest. So I certainly recognize the dollar can be weaponized. And I also, all the people that say the US is in decline, yes, the US political system is deeply dysfunctional and divided, but the dollar is at 20-year highs. And that has to do with the fundamental strength of US political institutions and the US economy. We can't forget that. Both of those things are true simultaneously, where in China, the Chinese political system is much stronger, much more consolidated than it's ever been in my lifetime, and yet their economy is in much worse shape. So it's a very interesting dynamic between the two most powerful countries in the world.
Yeah, good point. So now I have a young banker, Sanjay Agrawal. How do you read the rise of extreme right in some European countries, Italy, Sweden, etc., and the protests witnessed in Germany by its far right on Russian sanctions and energy policy?
I think that particularly not this winter, but particularly next year, which will be economically more challenging for the Europeans than right now, because this year, at least, they had energy from Russia that they could use to stockpile. So they're in better shape. It's very expensive, but the countries have money to provide subsidies to the poorest. They'll get through it. Next year is likely to be harder. I suspect that the peace movement, the opposition movement to sanctions will grow. Some of that will be far right. Some of that will be far left. It'll generally be populist. I don't think it'll move the policies, in part because European governments are getting weaker. The EU is getting stronger. The EU 27, they voted unanimously to bring in Ukraine and Moldova as members. They voted unanimously now for 8 rounds of sanctions. That is an unprecedented development for the EU, and 1 or 2 European countries can't move away from that. Also, the EU getting stronger means that even among these right-wing populists, there's very little Euroscepticism. With the coming prime minister, Meloni, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, you will find that she has a lot of very disturbing alignments on issues like treatment of women, treatment of immigrants, gay rights, you name it. But on the euro and on the power of the European Union, you're not going to find her arguing for Italexit. In fact, the Italexit party got, I think, only 1.6% of the vote. In France, very similar transition you saw with Marine Le Pen. Germany, very similar. In Poland, the more Eurosceptic party is likely to be voted out next year. I mean, this is a broad development as the EU gets stronger.
So it's not all going in one direction.
Not only that, what is happening mostly at the domestic level and isn't undermining the EU.
So Srinivas Rao, who wants to know, is the Ukraine war entirely Putin's fault? Aren't US and NATO equally responsible for expanding all the way to Russia's borders and forcing Putin's hand? Was it the intent of the US to force this war to this is a conspiracy theory. Was it the intent of US to force this war to reinvigorate the NATO alliance?
Yeah, I mean, look, I was talking to the White House, including to President Biden directly in the weeks before the war. And this was a man that deeply wanted to do everything possible to avoid the war from happening. Remember, the US had hard intelligence that the Russians were going to invade. There's a lot of reasons historically to be skeptical of US intelligence, but Biden was convinced of it and was looking for every opportunity not to get involved in this war. He really didn't want it. This war has certainly deeply dangerous for the US, for its allies globally, and the Americans would like to see the war come to an end. But the end needs to be with the Russians withdrawing to the pre-February 24th lines, unless the Ukrainian government is prepared to accept less than that. That's where we are. Now, the other point was, is this Putin's fault? And the answer is, of course, it's Putin's fault because Putin invaded. Putin, no one had a gun to Putin's head saying you had to invade. I know why he invaded. He invaded in 2014 in a smaller way, and he got away with it. And then, Trump is gone. He sees Biden as weak. Afghanistan's a disaster. Merkel's gone. Macron talks about strategic autonomy. And when Biden meets with Putin a year before, he doesn't even talk about Ukraine. He talks about cyber attacks and colonial pipelines. So I mean, Putin had many signals that allowed him to believe that if he attacked Ukraine, he'd be able to get away with it. And beyond that, the United States has also done a lot of things historically that are not exactly living up to American values and standards on the global stage. I mean, the second Iraq war, which was not a part of the world that America really cared about all that much, Bush decided to go to war with bad intelligence and killed an awful lot of people and removed Saddam Hussein's regime. That was a horrible regime, and it was human rights abusive and all the rest. But from Putin's perspective, the Americans did that. They got away with it. No consequences, even though the pretext for the war was completely false. So Russia goes into war with Ukraine with a pretext that's completely false, completely false. He says that the Ukrainians are committing genocide against Russians in Southeast Ukraine, which is a lie. But it's no more of a lie than Iraq is developing weapons of mass destruction. And so he goes to war at Ukraine, which is very important for him, after Biden basically tells him, look, we don't care much about Ukraine. We care about cyber. And Putin even responds on the cyber side. He tells his cyber criminals to stop attacking American critical infrastructure. And not only does the West respond strongly, but they increasingly are trying to destroy Putin's regime. So you can understand why Putin would be incredibly angry about that. But I mean, the fact that Putin thinks he's somehow justified because the Americans did a bad thing in history doesn't make Putin justified. That's insane. That's literally insane. I mean, so whataboutism is the definition of cognitive dissonance creating insanity in people. Real human beings do not say, well, he did a bad thing, so I can do a bad thing. That criminal got away with murder, and so I should get away with murder. No, you should go to jail is what should happen. Any person would say that. So, I mean, I just really think that it's not that I'm angry about it. I'm bemused by it. I don't really get angry. But I mean, come on, you got to expect that you're going to be called out for bullshit if you ask a question like that.
Now, that was another Bremmerism. What did you say? What causes cognitive dissonance? Before the F word.
Oh, I don't remember now. I was so excited. This was all. I mean, I'm not speaking from a script. We can find it if we pull it out.
I will find it.
Okay, good.
I will list it on Twitter as a Bremmerism.
Okay, good. I like it. And
now it will find fuel. So my newest colleague, Disha Bagchi, who's just been hired from a campus, is a student of international relations. In your book, she's read your book. In your book, you talk about 3 threats, one of them being more global health emergencies. During the early stages of COVID-19, vaccines were developed. There was a growing trend of vaccine nationalism. Do you think such trends will continue in case of future pandemics, or have we as a global world order learned our lessons from this experience?
Oh, no, we haven't learned our lessons. It was incredibly embarrassing. I mean, we had in the United States, we had surplus vaccines that were actually expiring. We were ready to have booster shots that a lot of people were skeptical of. And the Indians were begging the United States for one plane load of vaccines. And we said no. And I've spoken to Jai Shankar, the foreign minister, who I get along with very well. He was so frustrated at this point. It's so challenging to have a good relationship with the United States when the U.S. when it matters, when it counts, the Americans don't actually do the right thing and treat Indians like they're human beings, which they are. So no, we haven't learned from that. But I will tell you, vaccine nationalism happened, but it didn't last very long. And the reason it didn't last very long is because the companies were able to ramp up and discover these vaccines, reformulate them, and then produce them at extraordinary levels very quickly. So it might be that there's a technological fix here. It might be that even if there's vaccine nationalism, maybe it only lasts for a month. Maybe it only lasts for 3 months the next time we have a pandemic. And if we can't fix the governance, but we can still execute on the problem, that's good enough for me, frankly. I'm very practical when it comes to fixing things.
I'll take you back to something you said earlier. Why did you say Crimea would be the reddest of all red lines for Putin?
Because Crimea is majority Russian, unlike all of the other territories in Ukraine. Crimea, even when Ukraine was independent, was an autonomous region. It was governed locally. They had their own parliament that they elected with a Russian tricolor flag that flew above it. I've been there. I've visited there. I've met with all of these people. I did the first survey research ever done on the ground in Crimea when I was doing my graduate work in 1992. It's a very different place. And I think that first of all, if the Ukrainians were to invade Crimea, they would actually have very, very stiff resistance. Also, of course, there are military bases of Russia on the ground in Crimea that would be very effectively used against Ukraine. The Ukrainian government, the president has told European leaders privately that he will not invade Crimea, even though his public position is we're retaking all of it. I understand why he would say both of those things. That strikes me as plausible going forward.
Last question. So
Okay.
my colleague, our diplomatic correspondent, Nainima Basu, will the next war be a direct consequence of rapid climate change across the world?
Well, I mean, you could have asked me that question 7 months ago, or certainly 12 months ago, and a lot of people would have said yes. And the fact is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine had literally nothing to do with climate change. I'm not clear. I mean, I think that the next war could easily come, especially major war, could easily come from disruptive technologies and sudden advantages on the hands of a rogue state or a rogue organization or even a group of terrorists, as opposed to climate change itself. The big tectonic global challenges that we can see coming are coming from climate change. Absolutely. Those will definitely lead to a whole bunch of global conflict and smaller border wars and state to state wars going forward. But the next major war could easily come from something else.
So before I let you go, you talked about this earlier, disruptive technologies. How do you think that could lead to this new catastrophe? You just explain that, and then you are freed. You are out on bail.
Oh no, I really enjoyed this. I hope we can do it again. I'm just being yelled at by the people outside my office. When I was a kid, when you were a kid, we were worried about nuclear weapons, but we tried hard to stop them from proliferating. Even the Americans and the Soviets, no trust, tried very hard. We now have a lot of disruptive technologies that can be even more dangerous than nuclear weapons. Quantum computing, for example, lethal autonomous drones, for example, offensive cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence algorithms that lead to deepfakes. There are no organizations out there yet with any power trying to prevent the proliferation of those technologies. I am deeply concerned that we need to create such organizations and empower them, or we're going to face very significant challenges to our future on the planet.
So our next conversation elaborates on that. We'll not let that be polluted by anything else, and hopefully this Ukraine-Russia thing will be over by then.
From your lips to God's ears, my friend. And we got to talk about how you're being reincarnated as well. I'm interested in that.
Well, we meet in Davos in January, I presume.
Oh, good. Let's do it.
So on the side, if you can find a place to sit with some
I'll do it.
I will tell you in 2 minutes.
Perfect.
And
I look forward to that, sir.
I shall also give you the mantra to chant 51 times every morning.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you for reaching out. I really enjoyed talking to you and all of your colleagues there, and I look forward to doing more.
Thank you, Ian.
Bye.
Stay well.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank.